This video is going to be about the Ohio Constitution. This video is going to help you prepare for your end of course test and all of the questions that you will inevitably see about the Constitution of Ohio. I have a picture here of the actual document that was originally written and of course our state flag. So I want to talk quickly before we jump into the Ohio Constitution. I want you to make sure that you understand the Supremacy Clause. So in the United States, we have a hierarchy of laws, okay? So essentially a level of importance and what you have to follow. So let's say there's a federal law and a state law that contradict each other. In this hierarchy, you know, well, I always follow the federal law, okay, because it has more weight, it is more powerful than a state law, okay? So the U.S. Constitution is the end-all be-all of laws in the United States, okay? So essentially, anytime that there is a law that is in conflict with the U.S. Constitution, in theory, you could sue, get your case all the way to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court could throw that law out as unconstitutional. Okay. Now, it does not mean that you cannot pass laws that are unconstitutional because, like, Congress and state legislatures do that all the time. But also, the Supreme Court will throw laws out if they come across them in their court and they find that they do violate the Constitution. Okay. Then second, we have federal laws and treaties. Third, we have state constitutions like Ohio or Nebraska or Michigan. And then we have state laws and then local laws at the bottom, okay? So I want to talk about the Constitution passed in 1803, okay? So now it's important to remember that Ohio has actually had a few constitutions. This was our first, okay? And it had a lot of issues, okay? First and foremost, it just gave way too much power to the state legislature. The state court system and the governor in Ohio just couldn't hardly do anything. And, you know, as hopefully you've learned so far in government class, it's important to have the three branches that they are equal to each other because the other two branches help keep the one branch in check, okay? And it wasn't really set up like this. The state legislature essentially had like 90% of the power. The governor was there, but like I said, they couldn't do a lot. They only had a few specific powers, just a few specific things they could do. The state legislatures, the governor, they appointed judges and other bureaucrats, okay, but that was kind of their big role. And also this Constitution of 1803, made the Supreme Court of Ohio, the Ohio Supreme Court, go and meet in each county in the state once every year. Now, when the Constitution was passed in 1803, I think there were only about 20 or so counties, but by later in the state's history, we had 88, which is currently how many counties we have in Ohio now, 88 counties. And so to get to 88 counties, at least once every single year was very problematic because hopefully most of you know there are 52 weeks in a year, so that is way more than once each week. And it was quite difficult for them to travel around because, you know, they probably also wanted to, like, say, see their wives or children or spouses, I guess I should say, although at this point I doubt there were any women justices. So the state was just in so much debt too because, like I pointed out, you know, the state legislature was extremely powerful and they were also very corrupt because they didn't really hardly have any checks on their power. So they were trying to keep the canal system and railroads afloat, and they were going into serious debt to try and do that, and it was a big problem. Okay. So we have all these issues with this first constitution, and so they actually decide to scrap it and write a new constitution, and then that gets passed. Okay, they had a new constitutional convention where they came together and wrote a new one. This constitution is called the Constitution of 1851. Okay, and essentially this constitution gave now the governor and other top officials like Secretary of State, the Secretary of the Treasury, the state auditor, those officials are all elected, which is still how it is to this day. Okay, The governor at this point still could not veto bills, though, so the governor didn't have any role at all in making laws in the way that the president does at the federal level. It also outlawed poll taxes, which was important because also at this point, poll taxes were going to be outlawed by the federal constitution as well. For those of you who don't know what a poll tax is, essentially a poll tax was charging people to vote, okay? So there were a lot of places that you showed up, and especially if you were black, or, well, women didn't have the right to vote yet, but, or maybe Hispanic, or Asian, you might show up and try and vote, and they'd be like, okay, that's $100, please. And then you'd be like, I don't have that kind of money. So then you couldn't vote. Okay. So this outlawed that, making sure that voting was free. Okay. It created another level of the court system, which, because at this point we really only had that like state Supreme Court. Now this created some lower courts to help take the burden off that state Supreme Court system, which really needed it. And it also gave the legislative branch, still had a ton of power. They were still the most powerful, but they had a little bit less. And it also put some limits on how much debt the state could be in. So remember I said that the state went into a huge amount of debt to try and keep the railroads and canals afloat. And so it put some limits and said that you can only have so much. But it didn't really give them the power to borrow money yet, which they really needed to deal with how far in debt the state was. And then it said, except as otherwise provided in the Constitution, the state shall never contract any debt for the purposes of internal improvement. Basically saying you cannot go into debt for railroads or canals, essentially was the point of that. Now, we had this Constitution going forth for a while, and then around 1873, 1874, we were still dealing with a lot of issues, mostly because that legislature was still extremely powerful. So, they have another constitutional convention, and it's really different, okay? It created circuit courts. It gave the governor the power to veto bills, and then of course gave Congress the power to override that veto in the same way that the federal government has. It gave women more opportunities to hold office. It took away public funding of religious schools because up until this point, there were a lot of schools that were like Catholic schools, but they still got all their funding from the government as opposed to getting it from the church. It also was soundly defeated down by the voters. The voters, and it was kind of a surprise at the time, although now looking back, historians have said that the reason probably why it was voted down was this whole public funding of religious schools thing, because the Catholic Church had a lot of sway in Ohio at the time. They still do, really, and they didn't want their funding to be taken away, so they really lobbied hard against this new constitution, and it was not adopted, okay? So, we still have this Constitution from 1851, and it's still not working very well, and now it's 1912. And things still are going terribly in Ohio. And so basically they said, okay, well, writing a new Constitution didn't work very well last time, so let's just get together and write a ton of amendments, which is what they did. Okay, they wrote 41 amendments that would change that Constitution from the 1850s. Okay, voters approved 33 of them, so actually, you know, the majority, which was good. It gave rights to the accused in the similar way that we have from the Bill of Rights at the federal level. But remember, those Bill of Rights at the federal level only protect you from accusations from the federal government, not from state laws. So it was important to have that in there. It set a 8-hour workday in the state of Ohio, so meaning that if you worked longer than 8 hours, then you could get overtime pay. It also set up workman's comp, which just means if you get hurt at work, then you get compensation from the government to help you because you can't work because you've hurt, but it was probably the job's fault that you got hurt. So, you know, it's helping to protect workers in that way. One thing that one of the amendments that did not pass was giving women and African Americans the right to vote. Even though it's important to know African Americans already had the right to vote because the amendment passed at the federal level to the federal constitution that gave black men the right to vote was passed in 1870, so like 50 years. Yeah, so black men already had the right to vote for about 50 years, but unfortunately a lot of states weren't really protecting that right, and that did not get voted. That did not get passed. Women did not get the right to vote until 1920, so they had to wait another 17 years, 18 years, sorry, at this point, to get their right to vote as well. Ohio's current constitution, okay, so we kind of say that it is we essentially call it the 1851 Constitution because it is, but sometimes you'll see it referred to as the 1912 Constitution because it was changed so much from those 33 amendments that were passed, okay? So as it's written today, there are 18 articles with well over 100 sections. And that is compared to, think about, there are only 7 articles in the United States Constitution, okay, with a little over 20 sections. So essentially, one of the conclusions that you should draw from this is that the Ohio Constitution is much more detailed and much longer than the U.S. Constitution, okay? And for the most part, that was kind of the way the Founding Fathers wanted it. They wanted the states to be more detailed and have a lot of say in what happened in their own states, okay? Also, one of the big differences is that the Bill of Rights comes at the very beginning of the Ohio Constitution, whereas the Bill of Rights at the federal level comes at the end. Because remember, you know, Amendments 1 through 10 is the Bill of Rights there. So we had the Constitution first and the Bill of Rights came second. But here in the Ohio Constitution, Article 1, the very first thing is the Bill of Rights. And there's actually 21 sections in there. So there's more than like 10 what we think of as at the Bill of Rights at the federal level. So some highlights from that Bill of Rights, okay, in Ohio. It is, as I said, located in Article 1. And it has many of the same rights as you see in the United States Bill of Rights, but remember now it's protecting us at the state level for those things. Some other things that we see would be habeas corpus, which actually means to produce the body. That's what it means in Latin. And essentially, like, it would be something that you would try and get the judges to file on your behalf if you thought you were in jail unfairly. No imprisonment for debt, basically just saying that even if you rack up a huge amount of debt, they can't throw you in jail for that. It protects a lot of victims' rights. It also gives us protection from eminent domain and sets up the process for that. Eminent domain essentially means that the government can take some of or all of your property away from you. As long as it is for public good. So if they want to build a highway through your property, they can do that. They just have to pay you for it. They don't just take it away from you. They give you money for it, of course. But wrongful death damages in civil court, that is protected. And then one of the things that was added later was the right to choose your own health care. That was added after the Affordable Care Act was passed at the federal level. Okay, some other highlights from the Ohio Constitution. Here is a picture of John Kasich. He is the current governor of Ohio, although that is going to change just a few short months. Mike DeWine is going to take over in January because he just won election a few weeks ago as of the recording of this video. So if you're watching this after January 2019, Mike DeWine is the governor of Ohio. Articles 2, 3, and 4 establish the 3 different branches in Ohio. So the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. Article 6 has 6 sections, and it actually details our education system. So it's important to remember that the United States Constitution does not mention education at all. Okay, so that is mostly the avenue of the states. Okay, and so the Ohio Constitution talks a lot about education because of that. Okay, Article 14 is in regards to livestock. So, you know, it's a good thing to point out because there's a lot of states who probably wouldn't have something about livestock in their constitution because they're not an agricultural based state. Ohio isn't necessarily as much agricultural anymore, but they still have a lot of that. Article 15 is just entitled miscellaneous, and there's just a bunch of hodgepodge of things in there. There's actually still in a constitutional amendment that outlaws marriage between same-sex couples, but that technically shouldn't be in there anymore because that's been overturned by the Supreme Court of the United States. But they would technically, voters would have to go in and remove it, and it just isn't really necessary because it's null and void because of the Supreme Court at this point. There's also some stuff in there about the Ohio lottery, and also talks about who's eligible to run for office in the state of Ohio. Okay, if you have any questions whatsoever about any of these topics dealing with the Ohio Constitution, please reach out to your government teacher.